Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to another segment of HR Heretics. I am so excited to have my friend Ciara on the show today. So Ciara Lakhani, those of you might know her. We've known each other, I think, since 2016, Ciara, plus or minus. It's a very specific year, but I remember that year. Really happy to have you here today. So just to tee this up, we are going into pretty intense election. The US has had a lot going on, and we thought that Ciara would be great to have on here because she actually lives and works in Paris and moved internationally about 4 years ago, October 2020. And those of you who have made this transition or are making it now, or maybe coming back, we thought it'd be really interesting to talk about this. Ciara, in her role over in Paris, is focusing on executive coaching, advisory projects for scaling tech companies, and she is heavily tenured at companies like Dashlane. Previously was the first head of people at Compass, as well as an HR leader for GE back in the day, which is a breeding ground for powerhouse HR people. So welcome, my friend. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So question, Emily in Paris is a thing, right? Do you relate to this? Tell us about this move back in October in 2020.
Wait, hold on. What is Emily in Paris? Just so I know.
You know what? That was a test.
Read me in.
That was a test. I knew he'd ask that. That was a trap, and you fell right into it. I love it. Tell us about that and your move and what prompted this.
I also wonder sometimes if I would know what Emily in Paris was, because I sometimes don't watch a lot of TV, but due to the sheer number of people that ask me if I am just like Emily in Paris, I do admit I've watched every episode and with my French boyfriend. So I get to hear a lot of complaining about what the character does. And yeah, you can watch it afterwards and see if you think it's like me or your French board member and if it's realistic to when you've been here. But yeah, how to sum that up? I guess viewers can decide for themselves if I am just like Emily in Paris. I have a lot of feelings about it, but it's been interesting. And we both have dark hair and we're both Americans that came to Paris. So
Ciara, you're from New York. Is that right?
Yes.
Born and bred, you were in New York, so that's where you moved from. Okay.
And what's the story on how and why you ended up in Paris?
So I was working most recently for a SaaS company called Dashlane that does password management. And they were started in France. And it was back when I was still at Compass. And I got a LinkedIn message that said like head of people Dashlane. And literally exactly what went through my head, because the whole like imposter syndrome thing, I was like, wait, there's a very technical team of engineers that has an office in New York and I don't know this. What is wrong with me? I need to find this out. And I was also a Dashlane customer, so I was like extra shocked, and that's why I recognized the name. So I spoke to the woman who was recruiting for the role just for that. She's like, please, please, please come talk to the CEO. I find out it's only 5 blocks away. I'm like, I don't think, I think that company is too small for me right now. And I don't want to waste his time. She's like, no, you need to talk to him. I was like, well, tell him if he wants to talk to me, I can walk over. But like, I don't know that I'm interested in the role. And they convinced me. And we'll talk more about, what I like about French culture. But it was a distributed executive team across Paris and New York City at that time. And really going after an ambitious goal, but in a way that I think was like meant to be more sustainable, meant to take into account the different stakeholders, including the employee population. And as you said, as a very tenured old HR person since 2003, that really appealed to me. So that's how I wound up joining. And then I told them, you should hire this role in Paris, because I found out it was not that I didn't know about an engineering team that was in New York. It was that they were all in Paris. And as a very heavy engineering culture with always more than 60% of the headcount, even as we scaled a bit in product or engineering, I really felt the role should be there. And they said, well, we've been trying to hire for 9 months, but if you want to move there, sure. And I was like, I can't right now, but it's what I think you should do. But then during the pandemic, I could, and I did. So I came here 4 years ago, and the CTO and I swapped countries, and he's now in Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's like, I've always thought about what it would be like to be an exec in another country. I think for the people role, it's got to be incredibly challenging. Like you're walking into like a different culture with different labor laws and different norms. What was it like actually doing that?
So 2020, I think for all of us here and probably most of the listeners, it's like everything was challenging. So I'm not sure that I noticed it was more challenging. But if I go back to 2017, when I started with the company and most people were in France. And then when I launched Portugal the year following and we set up an office in Lisbon, it was challenging at the time, especially because at first the leaders, and these are French leaders, had a stereotype against French HR people and said that I couldn't hire any. And I was like, okay, but I'm sure there's all these laws we're breaking. I don't really know what they are. And I see there's websites in French and like, I'm not sure the translation is good. Things have improved since 2017 a lot, as you know. But the first time that I went into the office in person, I got feedback afterwards that it was not so bad because they were expecting somebody very overly excited and overly positive because this was their stereotype of American people. And they were like, you wore it, so that's good.
Wow. So can we just dig into more of they French leaders don't like French HR people, but they like American.
Well, I think only some leaders don't like French HR people, right?
Sure. What is the stereotype that turns them off, so to speak?
They didn't speak in the same words because it wasn't a company where people tried to get aligned first, which was good. And, French tend to be more authentic in general. But like what I remember about what I would say their consensus was basically the same stuff that people say about HR leaders in the US, except for especially in tech, the ecosystem is smaller here, especially in 2017. You hadn't had President Macron's let's make this many unicorns kind of initiative. So there were just far fewer people who could work with very technical teams and could also work internationally. And I think that was just the concern about the supply. But there is an up and coming generation. And when they eventually, after like 2 years, let me hire someone French, I think there's a lot of us here doing that. And the next generation is being formed and it's going to be better in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I love how you refer to the French as more authentic. I think that's a euphemism for very direct. I told you before our call started, my board member is French. And it's actually, I really appreciate that communication style. Was that communication style something that you had to get used to?
I'm a New Yorker who grew up with parents who didn't go to university. So that is one advantage that I have from my upbringing. And it's probably one reason why, like for me, in some respects, I feel less culture shock in France than I do on the West Coast. But so that didn't take getting used to. But I do think, to your point, is authentic a euphemism for more direct? Yes, but that's maybe not the whole truth, because I noticed that even the things that people think about at work, the things they talk about at the lunch table, the things people talk about in their personal life, people are in a certain way, like thinking about a broader spectrum of things and thinking about their own feelings and feeling free to complain if they want to, which is another big stereotype people have of French people. So it's just all around more authentic. Whereas like even me, because I am somewhat, American, I grew up there, I might be focused on like, I need to do this today and not thinking about as many things. So I think it's just a more authentic lifestyle if we generalize, which of course won't be true for every single person.
I mean, it's interesting. I was trying to put myself, in your shoes and moving out there. And one of my first questions that popped in my head was, how was it assimilating or integrating with other HR people there that aren't American? We've talked over the years and we have similar style, et cetera. I would be thinking like, oof, is the HR community going to repel me or accept me? Like that's a question even more so than the leaders, to be honest.
Yeah. So I think I was lucky because I had such a slow integration. One, because when I arrived, literally 3 days later, it became illegal to leave more than a 1 kilometer radius to go to any store that wasn't a pharmacy or a supermarket. And you couldn't go outside for more than an hour. Like I had colleagues who were taking their kids who were cooped up in a small apartment in the street to walk in circles. And they were like, this is not an approved reason to be outside. And I see you've been outside for more than an hour. Back up. So it was mostly the great French member of my team who I already had at that time, who she stayed in touch with the community. And she would talk about in French a lot of the things that we were doing. And then when I eventually started meeting people in real life, or even when I met people after the Unleashed conference that was here a few weeks ago, people will say to me, oh, I've heard through Camille the great things that you've done at Dashlane, et cetera. So I kind of had my French ambassador. And I think that people were also really curious to meet me. So that helped me to meet a lot of the really renowned leaders here who were just curious, like an American moved here and for what? And let's talk to her. There are a lot of meetups or events that will kind of be a hybrid of French and English. And 4 years ago, I could only say like hello, goodbye, and thank you in French. But luckily with the pandemic, I also had time to study. So now I embarrass myself with my accent. It's maybe my closest similarity to Emily in Paris, if I give that away. But I can understand people and I can make myself understood if I need to. So that's been easy.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk at companies I've been at historically when we've been looking at expanding into Europe. And there's this generalization that's like avoid France at all costs because it's impossible to do business there. Was that your experience, and how much truth is there to that generalization?
Well, I think the generalization is everywhere. So I definitely hear it. The company that I came here with was obviously started in France, but the CEO moved to New York. Most of the board members were American, other than one, but it's certainly something we encountered. But for me, it was kind of like once I saw how relatively easy it was to actually find a pragmatic way to adapt to the laws, I'm like, what is everyone talking about? So if I think about like what we had to do at GE to terminate somebody's employment, basically the same steps that you would have to follow in France with some small nuances that are different. If you need to have a reorganization and lay off more than 9 people, there's some steps you need to go through, right? There's works councils that need to be elected. But again, for me, it wasn't something that I hadn't kind of dealt with in a similar way before. And I think that some leaders make too much of it. And if you just go and you try to do it, it's like not actually that hard.
How did you learn those nuances?
Well, very slowly, since nobody in my company, as I said before, cared if I knew the laws right away. They're like, no, just figure it out. I mean, honestly, at Dashlane, some of the laws that we learned about, even after having been operating for more than a decade, it was not an early stage company. We learned about when our CSE or Works Council would kind of call us on it. And then we would look it up and be like, oh, that's right. And we agree with you. And here's what we can do to be compliant. And then once Camille started, we learned all the other things and figured out, what we wanted to do, what we wanted to put in place. And now that I can read in French and that more and more websites are translated, it's honestly easier than the US because there's a lot of really strong federal laws and there's not this 50 states and you have to see what's more protective to the employee. So it's relatively straightforward. There's some stuff that varies by your industry, but you know which collective agreement you're part of. And in the tech industry, most companies are in the same one, and you know kind of what the rules are and what you need to do with them.
I remember doing a bunch of kind of, ER work or whatnot overseas and working with French counsel and all the steps. And it just seemed like a huge mountain. Do you know what I mean? Like we're over here and you're like, oh, we got to do this. And it just was mind numbing in some respects. And to the spirit of the generalization, it's not just France. It's like,
yeah,
the UK is also like, it's a, and I don't know how to ask this, but like when you're there on the ground, is it similar to like maybe here in America where it just becomes second nature and perhaps you don't have to do like every single step perfectly and you can do like just become kind of like natural and it actually isn't the big mountain that I used to like think it was when I was going through the hell of it all?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. The other thing that I think, and like there's a lot of lawyers I've talked to in all countries, and I can't say if it's worse here or not, but like, yeah, they absolutely make things sound like that. And often the lawyers that I spoke with, I found myself negotiating with them. And there's been, again, some local HR professionals I've worked with where they're like, you can't do this because of this. And it's somewhat maybe kind of a cultural thing. Like one time I bought a piece of art and I brought it through the airport and they said, oh, this is a piece of art and you need this piece of paper. And I was like, I don't have it, but this is what I have. And they said, well, no, it's going to be impossible for you to bring this piece of art into the country. Just absolutely impossible. And they were very strict about it. But it was like, I knew that that's not totally unexpected in France. I kept talking to them. I kept showing them different things. And within 10 minutes, even if it felt super long, me and my piece of art were past the border and it was not impossible. So it's the same thing. But at my last company, in the end, we wound up finding lawyers to work with who actually the partner is not French, but has lived in France for many years. So I think it helps when you have people to talk to who have an outsider perspective. If you talk to people who have been working kind of only or mostly with French people, they might be talking to you in a way that, again, is natural and doesn't seem daunting for anyone in France. So it's really understanding the different contexts. So that can help to have someone to talk to. And that's what makes me at this point kind of like a translator of like, okay, the American people or the British people say they want to do this and the French people say, no, it can't. And I'm like, okay, but like we have a Venn diagram here and there's some overlap and we just need to translate for you.
Yep. Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes. Yep.
I find that that's a learning that's translatable into almost every aspect of life, like regardless of what culture you're in.
Yeah.
What's the Michael Scott quote? You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And so I've found this as well, as especially when you're talking to people that are either in positions of power or prestige, or they have some sort of like clout to them, like lawyers, I think, fall into this bucket. When they say you can't do that, I actually don't think that that's what they mean to say, but maybe that's how we hear it. Maybe that's just how they normally talk. And then the more that you pull the thread with them, specifically around like, hey, we want to accomplish this thing. How do we go about doing that? I think that that's the best way to go about things in life. Like to your airport example, like that's a perfect example. The story I've always told myself about other countries, though, is that if you screw up, the government's going to be incredibly punitive. Is that something that you experienced?
Oh, so technically in France, and I believe it's this way as well in Portugal, but it wasn't my personal liability. It was my country leader I hired there. You can have personal liability that there's supposedly no type of legal structure that you can get out of it. So I have worked with some people who are like, I don't want to do this because you don't understand. I have personal liability and et cetera. But again, I think of in the US, like you have reputational liability, even if you don't think you'll wind up in jail. But, maybe I don't take things seriously enough, because even when I went to the US Embassy this summer and I was doing a power of attorney for my wonderful former assistant who lives in New York so that she could get some paperwork I need to apply for citizenship next year, the person working at the embassy said to me, you get to keep your US citizenship if you become a French citizen, but they don't have any incentive to help you from the US side if you're also a French citizen. And if something happens, you don't know what's going to happen to you. So that was an interesting day where I was like, this person just tried to scare me. But pragmatically, when I'm like, okay, what do I do in my daily life? Is that likely to happen to me? And I was just like, okay, there's risk, but fine, I'm fine. I think people make a lot of it.
I just want to go back to what you said about being a translator. And I love that because I think it is translatable, no pun intended, right? Like even if you don't work internationally, right? Like the last 15 years in venture, I was like, listen, I'm just a translator between C-level executives, between the board and the founder, between the founder and the leaders and the employees and the C team. And I love what you're doing, because the more that you go out and see across the world, you're just like exponentializing the power of your ability to translate it just in different ways. And that's really cool. I just put that together. That's our jobs. We are translators between what is usually, stereotyped as two unreasonable sides, which is a silly way to think about it most of the time.
Yeah. It's a really good way to frame it, Kelly. I've had the opportunity to work with some really amazing lawyers and who are able to actually like translate me. And one of the tactics that they use, like when I say something like egregious or that like doesn't fit right into their like nice little bucket, they'll always say, I think what you meant to say is this with the goal of getting to this. Is that right? And, it seems like, Ciara, with what you've been doing, you're just able to do that. But I'm actually wondering how much of that effectiveness is because you're on the ground. That's the other story I tell myself, is I feel like it would be incredibly challenging to do your job from the US.
I did it for the first 3 years, right? I did the same exact job for the first 3 years. And so I'm glad that I got to live it that way. Was it easy? No. Did one of the co-founders want me fired and get a lot of the engineering leaders who were influential to agree with him when I first came here? Yes. Is he coming over my house soon for dinner, even though I no longer work with him and that went well in the end? Yes. But there's a lot of that. And I think, to the point that you're both making, even in a company, when you have to translate what the board said to what an entry level engineer wants, et cetera, there's just so much of that. And I find that a lot of things don't get done because people have a different way of framing up what they think it's important, or they don't feel that the other side listened to them. And what I'm really passionate about doing is like, okay, I'm going to hear you all out. And I'm going to be like, here is where we can agree. Let's start with this. And like, let's hopefully build some trust from this. And then we can expand where we can agree and we can get more stuff done.
Yeah. I'm definitely not going to let you sneak in that co-founder like tidbit without unpacking the entire story. So can you tell us what happened there?
So I don't know all of the pieces, but from what I can glean, and he can correct me later if he winds up listening to this, the first time that I came over, we took this walking meeting. So we're walking around in the Montmartre area and it's beautiful. And he's kind of asking me about my previous experience because he wasn't on the interview slate, despite my 8 hours of interviews, including on the 4th of July, where I was told, you don't have any patriotic reason to not interview on the 4th of July, do you? And I was like, that's fine with me, but I suggest you don't say that to other candidates. How about this is the last time you say that? So we're walking, and his takeaway was basically that he felt I was trying to have us start to do things like other companies did. And this is not the wording he would use, but the wording that like we would use now is like he wanted more evidence of first principles thinking instead of just like throw some best practices. And especially if someone is not from your country and you've been building your company for more than a decade, I can see where that's kind of something you're concerned about. And the person has an MBA, and people in engineering don't like that you have an MBA. So if they looked at you on LinkedIn, it's not good. It's better that people don't know my background if I talk to them. And luckily, our CTO said to him, like, hey, I hear you. And what I would like you to do is to keep talking to Ciara and keep giving her feedback. And in fact, every time she travels here, the two of you are going to go to lunch. So we went to all these difficult lunches. I cried during one of them. So I admit that, I'm a strong person, but also sometimes I cry. And we eventually hashed it all out. And I think it was you earlier, Nolan, that were saying about someone that you've worked with in France. You feel like everything's on the table. Like we put everything on the table. And there were some difficult debates. And eventually over time, that turned into strong trust. And it was also really helpful because when there was a change in something we were doing in the company, he would come, he would challenge me about it. And then people would ask him, what do you think about this thing that the people team is trying to do? And if he said, like, I debated this, and in the end, actually, I agree with these parts, like people listened. And that was powerful to have, and also made it much easier for me to do my job from New York and only usually coming into the Paris office once every 6 weeks. And after we launched Portugal, half the week, because I would split with Lisbon and then Paris. But no, it was working.
I have to ask. So, we kind of get real on here, and you and I do too. So it doesn't matter. But like,
yes,
I have to know, the three of us have been in this scene for a while out here, Silicon Valley, that tech venture, org politics. I've called it the Shark Tank multiple times, not in a good way. Like, how does all that work out there? Is it similar? Like, tell us about the org navigation, the politics. What do people care about? Is the whole tech venture scene a thing? Like, should I move there? Is it wonderful? Like, tell us about how that.
Each of those could be a podcast.
I know.
If you want to be referred to other people that live in Europe.
I'm teeing up the future here.
Yeah. Short, garbled together consensus answer, and then you can dive into anything else that's interesting. Is there actually a consensus on like what politics are anywhere and how you navigate it? That's one of those like mega translation is needed issues where like everyone's point of view is valid in some sort of way, but somebody else would say it totally differently. And I can remember when I walked the 5 blocks from Compass and I met with the CEO who I didn't think I was going to work for, and he had a sign behind him and it said things like raise the fucking bar. And another value was no politics. And at first I was like, have you heard about what's been going on at Uber lately? And do you feel that like this is the right wording, raise the fucking bar to attract the type of people that you're trying to hire in the US? And he had not thought about that perspective. And about no politics, our debate was, I was just like, I don't think that's reasonable. So you're saying that you want one of the things that I will do to be part of the executive team and be like the main person upholding the values, but that all executives should do that. And that's good that you believe everyone should do that, because you can't have values that people believe in if it's only coming from one place. But I just don't believe no politics is actually possible. Are you going to tell me that there's really no organizational dynamics here today that we could call politics? Maybe you don't think it's politics because it's not like the shitty politics you handled in the past, and you're the CEO now. And if you don't want to tolerate something, you don't have to. But if I ask every person here, are there politics? Is everyone going to say no? But in general, as we said before, I feel like people more so, they say what they mean. They want to live their truth on average. The tech scene is something here. They don't like politics. The traditional French business scene, or a lot of fashion companies, financial services, like very, very formal, very hierarchical. And in tech, I would think most people would say like, oh, we hate politics. And even when you talk to pretty late stage companies, they often talk about, we're proud that we've avoided politics. But yeah, if I'm honest, or somebody wants to get into a debate, I'm like, what are politics? Can you ever avoid them? Like in any group of people that keeps talking together several times, like, aren't there technically politics?
That's such a great story. And it reminds me of one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, which pissed me off in the moment. I remember being at DoorDash and working with my manager and being like, I hate these fucking politics. And I kind of just like threw my hands up like in a very immature, childish way. And he very calmly like looked into my soul and was like, Nolan, it turns out there's politics everywhere. And so you better get fucking used to it. And it's so helpful to like get your take on that, because I think we all tell ourselves stories. And like the stories I tell myself of like, what it's like operating in a place like France is like, oh, like people are really direct, but they probably complain a lot. They probably don't work a whole lot. And it turns out like everywhere has, yes, their own dynamics. Everywhere does have politics, but everywhere also has just like a way of like, this is how the thing works. And it seems like your trick is that like you figured it out. And so I'm curious about like the figuring it out piece. Was it just spending time with people? Was it like proving your work? Like what was that like to actually go and earn the trust?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of those things. I think something that helps me is, I know there's a lot of like business cultures, especially in tech in the US, where people had similar educations. They maybe came from similar backgrounds that kind of talk the same language about a lot of things. And it helps me that like I didn't grow up talking that language. And so I had to learn how to adapt and understand what people are saying. And so I think that made it a little bit easier to just apply that to, okay, this is a new country, but again, it's a language I don't speak yet. And which parts do we have in common? How do I learn it? But yeah, trust was really slow. And of course, like it's people work. Let's be honest. I'm sure there's people there today who don't agree with a lot of things that I did. And some of those people would tell me when they got drunk at after work drinks that, you made this decision 2 years ago, or let your direct report do it, and it's terrible and you should be ashamed of yourself as a person. And just a few weeks ago, one of my former coworkers who's no longer there and I'm no longer there said to me, oh, I realized I was like really unfair to you. They had not said that thing, but they had been part of the group that agreed with it. And now I see it differently and, apologized, which is always really validating. But yeah, you can't win over 100% of people. But I think all you can do is like be honest about what you can't share also, because people tried to get me drunk so many times and get like secrets out of me. And I'm like, sure, you can keep buying me drinks. That's great. But you're probably not going to get secrets.
That's a great French tactic, is just get somebody drunk to try and get them to be more truthful about things.
I have a great tolerance and I'm not telling you anything. Cheers.
Yeah, exactly. And my advice for how to deal with your French CSE or works council is smoke a cigarette with them after each meeting and have an informal conversation. No, that really worked. And then I would get on a Zoom with our CFO, who's in the US, but he's Belgian. So, he could attend these French meetings, and the HR leader who was doing the meetings. And I would debrief with them what I learned over the cigarette. And it wasn't sneaky, because the people I would smoke with, they knew I would do that. And I told them too. And it's just, but like, it worked. But I'm not condoning smoking. It's not healthy.
You're just meeting people where they are.
I know what I'm shipping you for the holidays. I have one last question. So you are now not at Dashlane anymore. You are out on your own.
Correct.
And that was under less than a year ago. Is that right?
Yes.
Anything like a lot of us are now, obviously, like fractional or interim or consulting, et cetera. How has that transition been in France and in Paris? And what's the demand like for us folk out there?
Yeah, I think similar to the US, there's a lot of people who are either not sure if they want to be dedicated to one company again going forward, or just want to break from it, or are in a search but are finding things in between. And especially people with international experience are getting projects. So that's a thing. I'm on a full-time project right now because there was a company that private equity put together a company from several countries, and there had been no comp philosophy that made it all the way to consensus, or formal promotion reviews or process or formal comp process ever. And I was like, oh wow, like that's very motivating to me. Let me help you people make decisions, and let's push through a process. And then there's smaller things too. So there's stuff here, there certainly is. And I think also people have a lot of goodwill for anyone who came here for a job and is still here after a few months, because they're like, oh, you're not going to leave. And luckily, unlike the US, like if you were at Twitter and you were on H-1B, right, like that's a tough situation. And that's not something that people on visas in France have to face, luckily. So that was pretty easy. And will I do this forever? Will I do one more operator role? Let's see. I am motivated to be like in a really French environment and become an executive in French one day if my accent can get decent enough. So
Is that a requirement?
it's kind of my personal requirement, because if not, I can fill up my calendar with work in English. And if I take some clients in the US at night, right, it pays a lot more because pay here is very different. But I live here. I like living here. I do want to assimilate, and kind of, when you've been doing HR for more than 20 years and you're like, okay, I have a lot of skills to give back, but I'd like to give them back in a setting where I learned something new. Like I learned something about an industry or a business model that I've never worked with before. And for me, one of those vectors of like learning something new is my journey in my 40s, learning a new language from zero. So yeah, it's my major hobby, and I'm honest about it.
That is cool.
That's so cool. I love that. What I've learned in this podcast is, in order to be successful if you move to France, is you need to drink, you need to have a French accent, and you need to smoke cigarettes.
No, we have Gen Z here too, right? So there's a lot of more like non-alcoholic drinks, and even in the liquor store, non-alcoholic things. There's a big movement of people who don't drink. There's fewer and fewer people who smoke. But yeah, kind of my age and above, that was the vibe, and cool to enjoy that a certain percentage of my time. So
this was great. We have not done a deep dive on moving internationally like this, so thank you.
Yeah, I learned a lot from this one, Ciara, and it's such a cool experience. And just from me to you, good for you for like taking that leap. I think a lot of people will tell themselves this story of like, oh, this is what it would be like, but like never have like, the audacity to go do it. And so thanks for taking us to school on this topic.
Good to talk to you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.